like to thank you all for coming out this evening. Thank you all for being here. Especially like to thank our visitors. Glad you could be with us. Hope that you can be back at any and every opportunity. Okay. It's going to work this evening. So tonight is another lesson under something that isn't really a series, but something that I've done a few different times, a few different characters, and that is the Old Testament shows of strength. And we realize that we have the Old Testament, and that the primary function of the Old Testament is to show us the prophecies of Jesus, and then, we look in the New Testament and we see where they're fulfilled. But there are multiple different purposes for the Old Testament. One of them is to show us the power of God, how He exercises it, and His faith to us, and Old Testament characters' faith to Him. So we can look at those characters, try to mimic them, try to see how we live our lives correctly today. So this evening we're going to look at a character, and his story is fairly popular, and it's Samson. Samson out of the Old Testament. If you don't know, it's found in Judges. It spans the chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16 of Judges. We're not going to read all of it this evening. We're going to hit some of the high notes. We'll kind of fill it in as we go along. But that's where you can find it. That's where we're going to be all evening, is in Judges, and we're going to start in chapter 13. So the first interesting thing we learn about Samson can be found in Judges 13, verse 6. Then the woman, which is Samson's mother, went to her husband and told him, "A man of God came to me. He looked like an angel of God, very awesome. I didn't ask where he came from, and he didn't tell me his name, but he said to me, 'You will become pregnant and have a son. Now then drink no wine or other fermented drink, and do not eat anything unclean, because the boy will be a Nazirite of God from the womb until the day of his death.'" So this is the first interesting thing that we learn about Samson. Of course, we know that Samson is going to be called to be a judge over the children of Israel. But the first interesting thing was, and I didn't put it in here, but it tells us in an earlier verse that his mother was barren, and that his mother and father could have no children. So whenever it comes and they have an angel tell them this, of course her husband is very startled with this. He prays to God to send them another angel, and he does, and they tells him the same thing that he tells him here, and we get Samson. And we understand that Samson is a very powerful character out of the Old Testament, and this shows kind of the first signs that God has something to do with Samson. Is he sends an angel to Samson's parents to tell them that they will have a child, even though that Samson's mother is barren. So this is the first sort of powerful thing that we see come out of this lesson, is God takes a barren woman and he allows her to have a child. So we look on, and Samson, he's born and he grows up a little bit, and we start back in Judges chapter 14, verse 1. Judges chapter 14, in verse 1. Samson went down to Timnah and saw there a young Philistine woman. When he returned, he said to his father and mother, "I have seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as a wife." His father and mother replied, "Isn't there an acceptable woman among your relatives and among all your people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife?" But Samson said to his father, "Get her for me, she's the right one for me." His parents did not know that this was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines, for at the time they were ruling over Israel. So this is another interesting thing to think about as we look at the story of Samson, is that Samson's his first female encounter, I guess you'll call it, because if you don't know the story of Samson, I'm going to spoil it. Samson has a problem with women. We're going to look at that a few different times tonight, but he definitely has a problem when it comes to women. And the first time we see that is whenever he picks a woman out of the Philistines, and this turns out to be something that God plays a hand into, because he wants to get the children of Israel apparently out of the hand of the Philistines. So this is the first time that we see this, and this is, again, God playing a role into Samson's life. He's putting his hand in, and he's kind of exercising his power and he's showing, or he's not yet showing, but he's setting up so that Samson can conquer the Philistines and that the children of Israel can be delivered out of the hand of the Philistines. So the story kind of goes along in verse 5. Samson went down to Timnah with his father and his mother, and as they approached the vineyards of Timnah, suddenly a young lion came roaring towards him. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, so he tore the lion apart with his bare hands, as he might have torn apart a young goat. But he told neither his father or his mother what he had done. So this is the first sign of Samson's sort of raw strength. If you've read the story of Samson, that you know that is kind of the thing that comes over him is his raw strength. He's had several instances where he's killed many different people, and he collapsed a building on top of the Philistines at the end of his life. And we'll look at that, but that is sort of the reoccurring occasion in Samson's life where he gets this amazing strength, and this is the first time we see it. The first time that the power of God is sort of granted in him, and the Spirit of the Lord comes over him, and he's granted this amazing strength to tear this lion apart. And again, this is sort of the first great power that Samson is given. And he takes this and he tears this lion apart, apparently to save himself. And I don't know if it means that he had torn apart a young goat, or if a lion had torn apart a young goat in this verse, but apparently something had torn apart a young goat. So we're going to move on. We're going to look in verse 15 of Judges chapter 14. Judges chapter 14, verse 15. Samson sort of went on into, this isn't in the verse, but Samson went on into Timnah to get his wife, and whenever he got her, he threw a banquet for the young men of that area. And whenever he did, going in verse 15, on the fourth day they said to Samson's wife, oh, I missed something. He told them a riddle. And it was about the lion that he killed and the honeycomb that was found in it. And he asked them that if they should find the answer to this riddle, he would give them 30 cloaks. And if they could not answer it, they would give him 30 cloaks. So this is the men sort of tormented his wife about this because Samson had come in, given them this seemingly unsolvable riddle, and his wife, which was from these people, was, why did you let him come in here and do this to us? Why did you allow your husband to do this to us? We're going to burn your father's house and everything in it if you don't tell us what the answer to this riddle is. So on the fourth day, they said to Samson's wife, coax your husband into explaining the riddle for us, or we will burn you and your father's house to death. Did you invite us here to steal our property? Then Samson's wife threw herself on him, sobbing, you hate me, you don't really love me. You've given my people a riddle, but you haven't told me the answer. I haven't even explained it to my father or mother, he replied, so why should I explain it to you? She cried the whole 7 days of the feast, so on the seventh day he finally told her because she had continued to press him. She in turn explained the riddle to her people. Going on, in verse 19, then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him powerfully. He went down to Ashkelon, struck down 30 of their men, stripped them of everything, and gave their clothes to those who explained the riddle. Burning with anger, he returned to his father's home, and he did not take his wife with him. So this is the second time that we kind of see the great strength of Samson come over him, and this is sort of the second time that we see Samson's intrigue with his women problems, come back over him, because his wife pestered him day after day for 3 days, the 3 days remaining, whenever they came and talked to her. And at the end of the time, at the end of the 7 days, he told her. And I'm assuming that she did not tell him that they were going to burn her house down, because if she had, then it probably would have been within the first 5 minutes that he would have told her what the answer was. But he told her. He eventually told her. He told her what the answer to the riddle was. She went and gave it to her people. And then we see him go into a different town and kill a number of men, 30 of their men, stripping them of their clothing and taking it to the people who explained the riddle to him. So again, this is the second time that we see something come over Samson. The second time he is given a great power in order to kill these 30 men, the Spirit of the Lord coming down upon him. So, it's just interesting to see as this sort of returns to him and his problems and what he falls into, and then he gets this power and he overcomes it, and then he goes back into his problems again. So in Judges chapter 15, verse 3, Samson said to them, this time, I missed something. I'm sorry. What happened in between this is Samson's wife was given to one of his companions whenever he left to be in his father's house. So when he comes back and he finds his wife with another person, he says this time I have the right to get even with the Philistines. I will really harm them. So he went out and caught 300 foxes and tied them tail to tail in pairs. He then fastened a torch to every one of the pairs, lit the torches and let the foxes in the standing grain of the Philistines. He burned up the shocks and the standing grain together with the vineyards and the olive groves. So this is another time that we see not necessarily great power come over Samson, which I'm sure it would take power to overcome 300 foxes, but great persistence come over Samson. In order to catch 300 foxes, it takes a lot of persistence. It takes a lot of going out and catching foxes. It says he tied their tails together, and he lit torches under their tails. And I'm sure that's not a very easy task to do, rounding up 300 foxes, tying them together, lighting their tails on fire, and then setting them into the field. And this is, again, whenever we see a great power come over Samson, a great instance in his life. So as this story kind of rolls on, the people find out that it was his wife's, or they found out that it was Samson. They go to his wife and they kill his wife. And he goes on and he kills the men who killed his wife. And he runs away back to the land of his father. And this is where we'll pick up again. Ooh. Okay. This is where we'll pick up again. As he approached Lehi, the Philistines came toward him shouting. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. The ropes on his arms became like charred flax, and the bindings dropped from his hands. Finding the fresh jawbone of a donkey, he grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men. Then Samson said, with the donkey's jawbone, I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone, I have killed 1,000 men. This is kind of the most, I'd say, impressive of Samson's doings. The Spirit of the Lord comes over him, a great strength comes upon him, and he slays 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. And this kind of shows, the great power that Samson possessed and the great power that God has. Because without the power of God, Samson might have picked up a donkey's jawbone, but he would have just been a man standing there with a donkey's jawbone against these Philistines who I'm assuming were armed. They might not have been, but 1,000 men, to kill 1,000 men with a donkey's jawbone, it's just extremely impressive by any man's standard. But we know that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. And that shows the power of God, Whenever we see this and we see what He is capable of, having the Spirit of the Lord, we see what God is capable of. Killing 1,000 men with a donkey's jawbone, that's no easy feat. Whenever God has this power and He exercises it, He can destroy entire cities at a time, as He did with Sodom and Gomorrah, as He threatened to do to the people of Nineveh in Jonah, at the time of Jonah. But, whenever we see this, and we see it in the form of a man, it tends to have a greater effect on us because, we think, well, he destroyed a city, all right, boom, the city's gone. But, you think of a man with a jawbone of a donkey, that's a tongue twister, in his hand, and he goes out and he kills 1,000 men. This is just a great feat, it's a great happening. And it shows the real power that God has. And that's kind of what we're looking at whenever we read these Old Testament these Old Testament happenings, these Old Testament stories. There's a great power that God has, and everything that happens through him. So we're going to move on. In verse 1 of chapter 16, that's Judges chapter 16, verse 1. One day Samson went down to Gaza, where he saw a prostitute. He went in to spend the night with her. The people of Gaza were told, "Samson is here," so they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the city gate. They made no move during the night, saying, "At dawn we will kill him." But Samson lay there only until the middle of the night. Then he got up and took the doors of the city gate, together with the two posts, and tore them loose, bars and all, and he lifted them on his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. So this is again kind of where we see the pairing of Samson's problem that he has towards women and Samson's strength that he is granted from God. We first see his problem because he walks into this town and he apparently sees this prostitute. And he goes in to spend the night with her. And again, we see that this is a problem that he has. But whenever he comes out, and this time it doesn't say the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, but I'm assuming that it took great strength that God had given him, God had blessed him with, to tear the doors off of the city gate, bars and all, with the posts, and carry them up on his shoulders to the hills facing Hebron. You know, this is a great amount of power that this man possessed, along with a great amount of problem that he had. So we're going to kind of see what happens whenever this problem overcomes his power. So in Judges chapter 16, we're going to start in verse 15, and I'll give you a little background. He found a woman in this town, and he wants her to be his wife. Her name is Delilah, and he comes in, and he is with her. Apparently, she is either his wife or just a woman who he is with. And she asks him several times, "What is the source of your power? Where do you get it?" And he tells her several different things. He says, if I'm bound with new, fresh ropes, then my power will leave me. If you braid my hair into the weave of a loom, if you braid it into a loom, then my strength will leave me, and I will be able to be taken down with the strength of a man. But finally, she overcomes him. She is persistent. She asks him several times, and it kind of winds up in verse 15 of chapter 16. And when she says to him, "How can you say, 'I love you,' when you do not confide in me? This is the third time you have made a great fool of me. You have made a fool of me, and you haven't told me the secret of your great strength." With such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was sick of it to death. So he told her everything. "No razor has ever been used on my head," he said, "because I have been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." And we kind of see where it wraps up, where his problem overtakes his power, a power granted to him by God. And I'd like to introduce you to something this evening, and you probably heard it several times, but it's the idea of the way that the devil tempts us. When I was a little bit younger, I thought whenever I woke up in the morning that the devil had this long list of all the sins that have ever been committed on it, and that starting in the morning he would try to do all of them until I went to sleep that night, and then the next morning he'd start over, and he'd try to do all of them until I went to sleep that night, and that it would happen for the rest of my life. It's not that way. I found that as I grew up a little bit. A lot of times, he takes this list of sins, and while he's young, he might try a lot of them. He may even try all of them. But he finds the ones that work. I tried this one, I tried this one, I tried this one. Those didn't work. I tried this one, I tried this one, I tried this one. Those did work. So he scratches them off his list, and he narrows them down. And he keeps scratching them off, the more that work, the more that don't work. And finally, he's left with one or two. and maybe it's more, maybe it's just one. I don't know. And with Samson, we can see clearly that it was women. That was his problem. And with us, you might know what your problem is. You might not know what your problem is. That one or two that sort of overtakes you, that he keeps using on you day in and day out. Samson fell into his temptation that was constantly given to him by the devil. We don't have the same strength power that he has. We have the same power he has. We have the same power and he has right here with us. We have the Word of God. We have God right here with us in our hands. We have His Word. We have what He told us. We have how He told us to live our lives, and if we live by it, then we can overcome those temptations. But if we don't live by it, if we neglect that power, if we let it sit and stand and we do nothing with it, then that power will leave us, just like it left Samson whenever he gave in to his sin. And with us, we're very lucky. We're very lucky that we have a way to come back to God. Because Samson, I'll just finish out the story, and then I'll go on about this. Verse 18, when Delilah saw that he had told her everything, she sent the word to the rulers of the Philistines, "Come back once more, he has told me everything." So the rulers of the Philistines returned with silver in their hands after putting him to sleep on her lap. She called someone to shave his head off, the 7 braids of his hair, so he began to subdue him, and his strength had left him. And he awoke from his sleep and thought, "I'll go out as before and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him to Gaza. Binding him with bronze shackles, they set him up to grinding grain in prison. But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Starting again in verse 28, then Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more. Let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Then Samson reached out towards the central pillars on which the temple stood, bracing himself against them, his right hand on one and his left hand on the other. Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more, when he died than while he lived. So I'll go ahead and put my conclusion slide up there and continue what I was saying. We are lucky. Samson was given a second chance. He was given a second chance in that whenever he was in his greatest hour of need, whenever he was in his darkest hour, he was standing in a temple of the Philistines, and they were making fun of him, and they were spitting on him. They had his eyes gouged out, and he was shackled to 2 pillars in this temple. And he prayed to God, and he asked him for one final blow, one final show of strength to get his revenge on the Philistines. And God granted it to him. Now, this sadly took his life. But we are very privileged in that whenever we ask God to forgive us of our sins, it doesn't take our life to do that. We can pray to Him and ask Him to forgive us of our sins. And if we repent and we turn from them, then He will do it. He will forgive us of our sins, and we can go on living free. And of course, the devil is going to keep tempting us. And as no man is perfect, we will keep falling into his traps. But, again, we are free. We are free of that fear of when we ask Him to die. we're free of that fear whenever we ask Him to free us of this, that we will die whenever it happens. Whenever we ask Him, He will forgive us if we make a change in our lives. And these are kind of the three main points that I wanted to get across to you tonight. And if you got them and you got something else, well, that's great, but these are the three main things that I wanted to get. The first thing is to watch out for reoccurring temptations. As it happened in Samson's life, he came upon several things that happened over and over and over again. And as we identified tonight, it was a problem, and he had it with women. He gave in several times, and he fell several times. But ultimately, his power saved him. And that's the second point that I want you to look at tonight, is that we need to trust in God's power. He has a great amount of power. So great, our minds cannot wrap ourselves around it. So great that He can destroy this world in the blink of an eye. Oftentimes we don't think about it like that, but He has that power. He has the power to grant a man the ability to kill 1,000 men with a donkey's jawbone. And even more than that, as he is near death, when he has been beaten, flogged, he has had his eyes gouged out, and he is at his lowest point. But He gave him the strength to kill more men than he had ever done in his life. And He has that same power today. And He has that same ability to grant it to us today. All we have to do is ask it of Him. The final point I wanted to get is for us to put our faith in God, and we do not want to be coaxed away from Him. That was the theme of tonight's lesson, was Samson's power and Samson's problem. And ultimately, Samson's power won because he came back to God in his final hours and asked Him to help him one last time. Samson could have lived out the rest of his life a blind man, chained to two pillars, doing nothing but standing there, taking insults, being beaten, but he didn't. He turned his life around. He turned to God. He asked Him to grant him power. So that's the theme of the lesson tonight. We don't need to let our problems overcome our power, because we have the same power that Samson had. We have it right here. And if we trust in this power, we read it, and we dwell on it, and we live in it, then that power will keep us. That power will keep us safe. That power is still God, and it is still here, and it is still with us to this day. So, to wrap it up tonight, if there's anybody who needs to come forward for any reason at this time, if you need prayers, for any reason, if you need to be baptized, would you please come forward as we stand and as we sing.